Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. It's nice to see so many of you here. I'm afraid we're slightly crowded forward because we have got a temporary exhibition on, and if any of you are amused by it, do go and have a look at Ned Kelly's armour, which is in the corner. It is only a reproduction, but try lifting a bit of it. How he managed to walk around with all that on, I have no idea at all. But there we are. But welcome this evening. On your chairs, as usual, you've got the flyer for the next talk, which is the journey from Afghanistan. It's going to be in June. We're hoping for a hot evening so we get a bit of atmosphere with it as well. But do book in for that. And we're looking now for the programme for next year. And we've got a few good speakers lined up. You'll probably be pleased to know that Emily Mayhew is going to come back to talk about Wounded at the start of the year. And she's going to do a double act with Harry Potter, son of General Nick Parker, who was wounded in Afghanistan and has written a book about it, which I think is called Anatomy of an Injury or Anatomy of a Wound. I can't remember quite which. But they're going to be doing a double act. We've also got Michael Maxton, who runs the Lord Ashcroft VC collection, who's going to come and talk about Victoria Crosses. We've got to talk about the Hampshire Archives, and I hope we have a fellow called Piers Story Pugh coming to talk about Burma and the Chindits. But this evening, we have got Rick Stroud back again. You may remember him as the person who facilitated the discussion in the evening when Vic Gregg was here and did a bloody good job in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you
very independent spirit is Vic Gregg. But this evening, Rick is here to talk about something which he has written about and published a book about, the SOE and Lonely Heroines. Think about the BBC television series. I thought it was called Ill Met by Moonlight, but I don't think it perhaps was that. But certainly don't think Hello, Hello. It's something completely different to that. We'll just wait for the two ladies to come in.
Yes.
Do you think you could open the door at the back? I think it's going to get a bit hot. Or if the noise from the diorama is disturbing you, then by all means shut it. Right. Rick,
okay, good.
Over to you, sir.
I think the TV show was called Wish Me Luck, and what I've written about are the women of F section. This is the book, which comes out. Unfortunately, there are no copies here today, but it will be out in paperback in July. And I've written about the women of F section, which is the French section of the Special Operations Executive, who were parachuted into France variously during the war. There were 39 of them, I think. I chose to write about 7 to use them as a sort of lens through which to examine what they did and what they stood for. So I'm going to talk this evening just to give you a flavour, because the stories are complicated and manifold. There are a lot of them. So I'll just try and give you a flavour for what they did and why I have found them so moving and genuinely inspirational. The SOE was famously set up by Winston Churchill, who said that he wanted, after we'd evacuated through Dunkirk, he said he wanted to set Europe ablaze and to start sending agents back into Europe, which had become a sort of black hole, to do sabotage and to do propaganda and to disrupt things. And so the Special Operations Executive was formed, and they looked for every sort of person. Thinking about F section, they looked for people who could speak French or who could get by in France, and getting by at a spy level in a foreign country where they're out to get you is a very, very difficult thing. It's not enough just to be able to speak even fluent French. If you don't understand the minutiae of the detail, and there's a Gestapo officer in plainclothes sitting near you, or a milice, and you do something slightly wrong, you've pretty well had it. They looked for university types, bankers, stockbrokers, lawyers, military men, Trotskyites, Stalinists, anarchists, burglars, bank robbers, pimps, members of who'd been in the IRA. I mean, anybody who they thought had a sort of feeling for covert operations, or who had skills that might be used. And to begin with, it was a very masculine, slightly patronising, patriarchal organisation. Then the women who were recruited, it was assumed that their job would be to do the typing and make the tea. And one man who was responsible for recruiting women said, He said, I like my girls to come from a good family and have good legs. And that was the sort of the way that the women were thought of. But the main recruiting was done by a man called Selwyn Jepson. And he was actually a novelist, and he would interview people in French, and he was variously dressed as a naval officer. He dressed sort of almost as he saw fit. He did just assume ranks. He didn't want to be identified, and he wanted to sort of confuse the interviewee. And they used to be interviewed in a blacked-out hotel room in central London. And he came to the conclusion that women would be much, much better in the field than men. And that wasn't to denigrate the men at all, but he had this feeling that they were better at operating on their own and at putting up with the real pressure and the boredom of life in the field. And he said to his colleagues and to his superiors, that's what I'd like to do. And they said, oh, no, you can't possibly have women. I mean, it would just cause chaos and they'd be no good at it. And Jepson didn't like this, and he went on and on about it, and he eventually found himself in front of Winston Churchill, and he said, Prime Minister, he said, I think women have a cool and lonely courage that would make them better than men. I would like to start recruiting women. Do you agree? And Churchill looked at him, and he records Churchill's looking at him and going, yes, good luck. And that was... And so he began to recruit women, and he looked, as I said, mainly for women who were French speakers, who'd ideally lived in France and who ideally had French parents. There were two women that I'll talk about to begin with who had already sort of snuck their way in. One was an amazing woman called Christine Skarbek, who was a Polish countess, and the other was a very interesting woman who had lost a leg, called Virginia Hall, and she was an American diplomatic secretary who had been put down by her employees. Skarbek was described by, I think it was the British ambassador in Budapest, as the most intrepid woman I've ever met, the most intrepid person I've ever met, man or woman. And she loved danger. She loved the sort of the rush of adrenaline. She was a great skier. She was a fantastic rider. She was very, very sexy, and she enjoyed seducing men, and men enjoyed being seduced by her. When the Germans invaded Poland, which was their sort of first, as you know, their first sort of major move in Europe, and the German soldiers were told by Hitler, close your hearts to pity, be harsh, be remorseless. And on the side of the railway trucks that took the troops into Poland, they chalked, we're going to Poland to thrash the Jews. And that really meant that Poland was the first country to turn into a black hole. Nobody knew what was going on in there, and it was the Nazi aim to eliminate the Polish middle class and sort of destroy Poland. And they began to do a very, very, they and the Russians began to do a very good job at that. And as Christine heard about this, she was on her way to South Africa with her first husband, and she immediately went back to London. She was an aristocrat, she was a countess, and she had some quite high-level contacts, and she was also a very, very difficult person to resist. And the man who interviewed her, she managed to get straight to the top. She made a fantastic impression on him, and he said, I really believe we have a prize. And they trained her very, very quickly, and they sent her via Hungary into Poland to distribute propaganda and to gather intelligence. And in order to get into Poland, she had to cross the mountains. And as a skier, she thought that this would be a fairly simple thing to do. And as she was trying to get herself together, establish herself in Budapest, she met a man she'd known before the war who was a one-legged hero. He was the holder of the Virtuti Militari, which is the Polish version of the VC. He was very, very handsome, tall, blue-eyed, another sort of charismatic man, and she met him. She saw him and realised she knew him, and that night they spent the night together in Christina's flat in Budapest and became lovers. And in the morning, the man whose name I won't reveal at the moment said that the maid came in and he had to hide in the cupboard whilst the maid served Christina her breakfast. But she said, but when Christina said, "Look, I want to ski into Poland. I want to ski across the Tatra Mountains into Poland," he said, "You're raving mad. It's winter. It's hard even for the Olympic skiers who are being employed as agents to do that. You'll never do it." But she went on and on and on. So this guy found her a guide who was an Olympic skier, and he led her across the mountains into Poland. And of course, the inevitable thing happened that as they were crossing the mountains in the freezing cold, with finding the bodies of dead people who had tried to cross, they became lovers. And Christina won another thing. She was very, very successful. She got to Warsaw. And again, I can't stress how dangerous it was that the Germans were out to get people. And at one point, somebody said to her, in Polish, which I can't possibly do, but they shouted, "Oh, Christina, Christina, what are you doing here?" Which could have completely blown her cover. And she pretended, "I've got nothing to do." And Christina was half Jewish. She said, "You've got the wrong woman. You've got the wrong woman," and sort of bluffed it out. But she managed to set it. She went all around Poland on foot, by horse, by whatever transport she could get, and she managed to set up, I think she did 2 or 3 trips into Poland. She set up a mobile radio station, a weekly clandestine newspaper. She asked London to send £100 a month to pay for the newspaper, and she also asked for arms to be sent to Poland to fight the Russians. And somebody in London wrote no on this no account. And I don't know why he wrote that, but I've seen the document, the signal, and it's underlined and in capital letters. She also managed to smuggle out of Poland an anti-tank gun that was a new weapon, and she discovered that this weapon existed, found one, sawed off the stock, sawed off the barrel, and took the sort of mechanism to London. It was a very effective weapon. I don't think it was actually ever used. An sort of example of how she deranged men is that there was one man who was completely in love with her, and he said, in Warsaw, he said, in Budapest, he said, "If you don't let me be your lover, I will castrate myself with my revolver." And he tried to, but he managed to shoot himself in the foot. So that didn't work. And then he was so desperate, this poor bloke, that he thought he would drown himself by jumping in the river, forgetting, of course, that the river was frozen. So all he managed to do was break both his legs. But that was a mark of what a powerful personality she was, and that personality would come to serve her very, very well later in the war. But she ended up, after this period, in Cairo, slightly marooned, nobody quite knowing what to do with her. But she eventually escaped from Budapest with the help of the British ambassador, who drove her out, he said, folded like a penknife in the boot of his car. And he said, "Christina can do anything with dynamite except eat it." And that's the sort of woman she was. And she was, she's a really inspiring person. The other person was Virginia Hall, who had lost a leg in a shooting accident in something like 1934 or 5, and this had prevented her from being promoted in the diplomatic service. She wanted to be a diplomat, and they said, no, you can only be a secretary. And some swine found a thing that said anybody with a physical disability couldn't be employed as a diplomat, and so her career was stopped. She got so fed up with this that she went to Paris, drove ambulances as the Germans were invading, and eventually escaped to England, where she had the idea that as she was American, she could operate in France as an alien in the open. So she got after several tries with various things, she met a man called Nicholas Boddington, who was the second in command of the SOE, and she got a man who was the editor of the New York Post to employ her to go to France and to send reports to America of how what life was like in that country, and also to that would be her cover while she set up an organisation. And lots of people said, "Oh, no, this isn't going to work at all." But she became the single most important British agent in Vichy, France, which was the so-called free liberated zone, and moved about quite freely. There's quite a nice story that when she was being trained by the SOE, she was quite a big woman, and she looked quite sort of masculine, and of course she wore a uniform which was like sort of denims, and the instructors couldn't work out whether she was a man. They knew that she wasn't quite. There was something strange because he limped, and they didn't know whether she was a man or a woman, and she had to prove that. Once they found out that she was a woman, they began to sort of denigrate her, and she proved that she was up to the job. Especially when they were doing unarmed combat training, and they had to pretend to cut people's throats with wooden daggers. And one day she put her lipstick on the dagger and slashed this guy's throat, and he suddenly had this massive red slash across the throat. And she said, "I can do that. Don't worry about me." And she was sent in, and she did a wonderful job. And somebody wrote about her. They said that if another agent said, "If you go into Christine's kitchen, that's her kitchen in France, you will meet every important undercover agent from England." And she looked after people. She had so much work to do that she just couldn't cover it. And there was one point when she said, "Oh, I'm having trouble with Cuthbert," which is what she called her wooden leg, or her foreskin. And she got a signal back saying, "Well, shoot him then." And I'd forgotten what she was. Anyway, she was really good, and she was really organised, and the sorts of people that she used were, when she arrived in the city where she was working, Lyon, she met a man who was a British pilot who'd been very badly burned and was waiting. He was so injured, he was waiting to be repatriated. But he said, "Look, Christine, for God's sake, don't trust anybody. This is a very, very weird city. You will be betrayed. Let me lead you to people who will look after you." And he took her he found people who ran the railways, who were doctors. They set up a psychiatric unit where escaping British soldiers could be hidden. And he introduced her, probably most importantly, to the madame of a brothel. And the brothel was a very important source of information. And as you probably know, intelligence gathering isn't really about getting huge bits of information. It's about getting tiny bits of information and sending them to somewhere that can put them all together. That, the fact that there are lorries with a certain badge on them travelling through, that there are soldiers going to that can all add up to the big picture. The agent themselves can't see the big picture. And of course the German officers using the brothel, lonely, often quite frightened men, would talk to the prostitutes, and the prostitutes would then report to Virginia what they were being told. And so that was a very, very fruitful source of information. Pillow talk. All this was being run. F section was run from Baker Street in London by three people. One was a man called Maurice Buckmaster, and he had working for him a journalist called Nicholas Boddington, who was the first person that Virginia Hall met. Boddington had been described as somebody said, "Oh, Boddington, he's a total shit." And what Buckmaster didn't realise was that Boddington had contact with the Gestapo before the war, and that a friend of his was now the head of the Gestapo in France, based in Paris. And we will never know what the relationship between Boddington and the Gestapo really was, because a lot of the SOE records have been lost or destroyed. Working for Buckmaster was a woman who started as his secretary and became his head of intelligence, his intelligence officer, and she was called Vera Atkins. And the very, very strange thing about Vera was that she was a Romanian, and she hadn't been naturalised as a British citizen. She was at the centre of one of the most secret organisations of the war, And the question that we have to ask is, what was she doing there? She was another woman, another person with a very powerful personality. She was disdainful of people who worked for her. She wouldn't write things down. She kept everything in her head. And she too had had contact with the Germans. As the war started, she'd had to pay some money to a German officer to get her brother out of Europe. And I have heard it argued by a man who knows his stuff, a special forces officer who has specialised in the history of the SOE and of intelligence gathering. And he said it is not inconceivable that Vera Atkins was a double agent working for the Russians. And if you think about Philby and Maclean and the extent to which the SOE had been penetrated, that is not unlikely. But because Vera Atkins never wrote things down and wouldn't answer questions and was very keen that only her version of the story was told, we again will never know whether that was true. But she was a scary, dismissive woman, and the point about Buckmaster was that he was a complete amateur who had been working for the Ford Motor Company in France before the war. He had no military training whatsoever, but he could speak French, and he did know France quite well. And he was on what you might call a sort of vertical learning curve, and I'll come back to him to show what a disaster he was as a leader. So whilst that was the SOE in Baker Street, in Paris there was a secret organisation which was run by a Polish intelligence officer who had set up an intelligence gathering thing and had established three or four radios in Paris, and he was in love with and worked with a very sexy woman called Mathilde Carré, who he called the Cat. And between them, they went round organising what turned out to be one of the biggest intelligence networks in northern France, and it was called Inter Alliés. And Mathilde Carré used to wear a fur. The thing about being an an agent, is that you want to be invisible. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just be grey, be invisible. She used to go around wearing a red beret and a fur coat. And eventually she was betrayed to a German sergeant who was another intelligence officer in the Abwehr called Hugo Bleicher. And Bleicher was really a carpet salesman, but he had a very uncanny way of getting inside people's heads and working out what they were doing. And he called himself Colonel Henry. And he realised what Mathilde Carré was up to, and René, her lover and the man who ran the organisation, and he found them in bed together and arrested them. And that night they were split up, and that night Carré was put into a stinking prison for women. She was screamed at, she was shouted at. It smelt of pee. It was absolutely horrible. And she lay there in her fur coat. And then the next morning, she was taken into Bleicher's office and was offered coffee, butter, sugar, milk, croissant, treated beautifully, not screamed at. And Bleicher made an ultimatum to her. He said, "You can either work for me or I'll have you shot." And he'd so demoralised her in that 24 hours that she decided that she would work for him. And that very day, they went round to the people that she had recruited, and because she was there, and she said, "Oh, this is my friend. You don't need to know who he is." And they were arrested one after the other. And when the agents saw Mathilde Carré, they thought, "Oh, it's good old Mathilde. She's our friend." And the next thing they knew, they were in a Gestapo car heading for a brutal interrogation. And the last people they captured on that day were two men, a husband and wife team called the Hugentobblers, who ran what they called a sort of post box. And as she was arrested, Madame Hugentobler said, "What about my baby?" Because she'd just got this little baby, which was about 9 months old. And Bleicher said, "Madame, France will look after your baby." And she was taken away and split off from her husband. And that night, Mathilde Carré became Bleicher's lover. She said it was the most disgusting thing, but that's what she did. And Madame Hugentobler hanged herself. So that's the sort of level of the stakes. And then Bleicher set up this thing which he called the Cattery, and they ran Mathilde Carré's radio that was transmitted to London, but now they just told London what they thought fit. They began what became known as the radio game. And over the next few months, hundreds of agents were arrested, and the inter alia network was completely penetrated and destroyed. As this was happening, a senior resistance worker, a man called Vomicourt, needed a radio, and one of the things you have to remember is that the radio is the most important thing that you can have. Without a radio, you're blind and deaf. You can't receive orders, you can't send out information, you don't know what's going on. And Bleicher thought, we will get this man, he's a senior a senior resistance man, and we will somehow do something between him and Carré to penetrate everything. He suddenly saw sort of megalomaniac vision of how he would win the whole war. But Vomicourt thought that something odd was going on, and after a while he confronted Carré and got her to confess to what she was doing. And the events that then followed, it was like a sort of a carry-on film. It was I know that you know that I know that you don't know that what I'm doing. And Bleicher came up with this idea that he would send Vomicourt and Carré to London, and that she would be a sort of Matahari, and that they would penetrate the British intelligence in London. And they had 3 goes to get her out of France. And at one point there were beaches with German agents, British agents. Out to sea there were British ships to pick up these people, with German ships being told not to stop them. I mean, it became a sort of farce. But eventually they got Carré out with Vomicourt, and we knew through Vomicourt what was going on. So Carré was debriefed. She was put in a very classy hotel, and Vera Atkins spent the next 6 weeks with her. And we began to play the radio game in the other direction, transmitting stuff that apparently came from Carré. So you see how complicated it gets. And this time it was Bleicher and the Germans who were believing it. And after 6 weeks, Carré they'd got everything they could get out of Carré. She was arrested, she was kept in prison, and after the war she was sent back to France, where she was tried and condemned to death, and that was transmuted to a life sentence. And then after a while she was freed, and she died a blind, unhappy woman who had betrayed all her friends and led to the death of a lot of people. So that was the Germans were very clever. They were very good at gulling us in Baker Street. And coming back to Maurice Buckmaster, the level of his incompetence is sort of demonstrated by the fact that we needed a what was called, I think, an air landing officer in France to organise the aeroplanes that were flying in our agents and flying in our agents to parachute in. And Nick Boddington, who, remember, had quite high-level Gestapo contacts before the war, said, there's this man called Dericourt. He's a fighter. He's an ex-test pilot. He's just what we want. And Vera Atkins said that when she saw him, she said, my heart sank because I thought this was a man I couldn't trust. And Boddington said, oh, no, he's absolutely first-rate. He's just the sort of chap we want. And so Buckmaster said, yes, he's first-rate. He's just the sort of man we want. And they hired him to work on the ground in Paris, in France, knowing a great deal about who was coming, who was going, and what was being transmitted. And what Buckmaster didn't realise was that Dericourt was working for the Gestapo. He had a Gestapo number. He was being paid something like 5,000 francs for every agent that he betrayed. And that is the sort of level of how wrong Buckmaster got it at a more, and I'm quite severe on him, who's a man who is thought of with great affection by some of the people who worked for him. Another level of, another indication of how he was sort of blundering about was that if you are an agent and you're sent into France, when you transmit back, you have what's called a true check and a bluff check. And those are things that you can leave out. If you leave out the bluff check, it doesn't really mean anything. If you leave out your true check, it means that you are operating under duress and that you are in prison and that there are German intelligence officers or Gestapo officers at your elbow. And one of the women who was sent in was immediately arrested because of Dericourt, and she left out her true check on her first transmission, and Buckmaster sent a message back, "Be more careful next time, you've left out your bluff check and your true check." So the whole thing was completely blown with that one transmission. It can make one quite angry. One of the, I think, the most interesting women is a woman called Noor Inayat Khan, who was a very, very gentle Indian princess. Before the war, she'd been a writer of children's books, and all she really wanted to do was set up a newspaper for children. She'd been published in England. A mark of how gentle she was is that her father, who was a Sufi mystic, used to sing her awake in the morning. And she's an utterly enchanting character, and she was also a very brave character, and so she wanted to do more than just serve in the armed forces typing letters. So she volunteered. She'd lived in Paris. She could speak French, and they trained her as a radio operator. And halfway through her training, another organisation in Paris called Prosper was penetrated, and there were now almost no radios available in northern France. And Buckmaster was pressurised to send her in, half trained. And one of her trainers said, "If that woman's an agent, I'm Winston Churchill." And another one said, "Do you know what her bastard father told her? He's told her that she must never tell a lie." And because she was a very spiritual person and a very literal person, Noor Khan took this literally, and they had to find a way to get her so that she could lie. And they did. I mean, there was some sort of psychological thing that they made it okay for her to lie. But she was so. And another of her. One of the trainees said, of the training staff said, "For God's sake, don't send this woman into France. She won't exist." But she was sent in by Buckmaster and received by Dericourt, who knew exactly who she was and where she was going. She was eventually, after quite a long period of time, captured. The Germans knew who she was. They could never quite work out where she was, and eventually she was betrayed by the wife of an agent, a resistance worker, and she was arrested. She fought like a tiger. She bit the man's hand, the arresting officer's hand, so badly that he had to have stitches in it. She tried to escape from the top floor of the fifth floor of the building she was in by climbing out of the bathroom window. She was dragged back in. She tried to escape again. She was interrogated, and eventually she was classified as what's called a night and fog prisoner, and highly dangerous. And she was chained to the floor. She was kept almost naked. She was beaten regularly, treated very, very badly, given very bad food, and her radio was used to transmit things to London. And people said, "Look, they got a message in Baker Street saying Madeleine, which is one of her code names, has had an accident and is in prison, and is in hospital, which means that she's in prison." And Buckmaster refused to believe this, and refused to believe that the radio messages that he was getting were coming from the Germans, and even went so far as to write her citation for the George Medal. Noor Khan is in prison. Buckmaster is writing the citation saying, "Agent Khan has behaved with great bravery. She has reconstructed an entirely destroyed network. She is operating, in the presence of the Germans, and everything is great, and the whole system is in perfect working order." and she wasn't. Poor Noor was just being beaten day after day. On a slightly more jolly note, there was another agent called Violette Szabo who was French and who'd married a Frenchman. Just after the fall of France, she could speak very good French, and they trained her and sent Violette in with 100,000 francs to find out what had happened to a circuit called Salesman. She was incredibly good, very brave, a bit like Christine Skarbek. She found out that Salesman had been completely destroyed. She sent all the messages that she could back, and then they said, right, you've been there for 3 weeks, come home now. She went to Paris with all this money that she still had and bought herself. She'd never had so much money. So she went to a couturier, Edward Molyneux, which was used by Garbo, Dietrich and Gertrude Stein in the same road as Maxim. So up the road she could see these big German staff cars with German officers all strutting into Maxims. And she bought herself a dress and clothes for her child Tanya. And Tanya is still alive, and I know Tanya. And then she got back and was quite a hero. Christine Granville eventually got herself sent back into France, and she parachuted straight into the Vercors Plateau, where there was quite a big fight going on between the resistance. D-Day has now happened, and the resistance for a moment thinks, yippee, we'll now make these bastions from which we will fight the Germans. A very, very bad idea for undercover forces to try and operate like that, because they're not equipped to, they don't have the equipment, and they cannot, they have light weapons. At the most they've got anti-tank guns, but generally it's Bren guns and machine guns and rifles. Christine was parachuted straight in, and she met a very, very handsome man called Francis Camert, who was an important British agent. And before we know it, Francis Camert and Christine are lovers. And they escape from the plateau together. There's one marvellous moment when they're in bed, the Germans, the whole plateau is sort of being overrun, and they're in a hotel, and a German fighter bomber comes straight towards the hotel window, and Christine and Francis, who spent the night together, look at this thing thinking, this is it, and a bomb is dropped by the aeroplane, which skids off the roof and thuds into the bank behind the hotel without exploding. And Christine, they both said, we thought that our game was up, and they escaped to live and fight another day. I can't not mention here the sad fate of a woman called Andrée Borel, who was an agent, and she was sent to Natzweiler concentration camp with 3 other women. And that Natzweiler was a male concentration camp, and when they arrived, these 4 women were all dressed in civilian clothes. They didn't look like prisoners, and the men in the camp, some of whom were SOE agents, thought, oh, they're going to start a brothel here for the guards. And these women were led down the camp. One was carrying a fur coat. They had makeup on, and it was very strange. And they were taken to the hospital block at the end of at the bottom of the camp. And why they were really there was that they had been sent there to be executed, and the order came as they arrived, execute these 4 women. The Germans then began to argue the toss with each other about how they should be executed, and the hangman in the camp said, well, he said it wouldn't be right to hang them. So the doctors were saying, well, how will you do it? And they said, well, we'll give her a lethal injection. And they debated what the right way to inject them was, and they decided that they would inject them with phenol. I mean, the phenol is a very, very powerful corrosive thing that leads to convulsions. It paralyses your nervous system, and you die. And that night, these 4 women were injected one by one with this stuff, and became they couldn't speak, they couldn't move, and one by one they were put alive into the furnace of the camp, the oven where they burnt bodies. And the last woman to be put in woke up as she was being slid in, and she shouted, "Vive la France!" And we know this from the man who did it, because some of the guards were interrogated after the war, and she scratched this man's face, and he bore the marks of that for quite a long time. And the next day, we know a lot of this because there was a British officer in there who was a graphic designer, and he saw them going down, and he drew them, and the picture that he drew is in the Special Forces Club now to be seen, and he remembers seeing a German sergeant walking back the next day from the sort of the crematorium, carrying the fur coat that one of those women had carried into the camp. So that's a very harrowing thing. Dericourt was eventually tumbled. MI6 said this is not good. He must come home, and under a lot of pressure, Buckmaster brought him back, and we'll never know what he really did. We do know that he betrayed people to the Gestapo. We do know that when people wrote home, the agents wrote home, and their letters were taken in by Lysander. But before they were taken by Lysander, they were photographed, and then when a captured agent was being interrogated, often the letter that he'd sent home was shown to him, and they said, "We know all about you," and that's an incredibly demoralising thing. We know all about you. Here's the letter you wrote to your mother. Here's the letter you wrote to your brother. It's a very good way in a frightening situation to break somebody psychologically. But Dericourt eventually was killed after the war in a flying accident, and nobody really knows what he did or what damage he caused, but everybody thinks that he did a lot. By now, D-Day's happened. The Germans, the Americans have invaded the south of France, and that's where Christine and Francis are now working to prepare the way for the advancing American troops. And two, I think, really good examples of Christine's bravery was that she was in the Alps and was she was discovered by an Italian patrol who had guns and were going to arrest her, and she had, as she was being surrounded, she pulled out a hand grenade and pulled the pin out and said, "Okay, you can arrest me, do what you like, but this is a hand grenade and this is the pin." And of course, if she dropped the pin, that would be the end of them, and they all scarpered and left her to it. On another occasion, a dog patrol found her, and this very, very fierce German shepherd dog, snarling, came up, found Christine. Her power over anything was so strong that she began to tickle this dog's ears, and the dog became her friend in seconds. And the handler was shouting, "Freed streets, where are you?" And the dog pricked up his ears and then just went back and licked Christine's face and went back with her to headquarters and became an allied dog. It's and that's that it takes a lot of nerve to do that, let alone with a sort of trained tracker dog. But the glorious thing about Christine is that she heard when as she came back to the base that Francis and a British officer called Zan Fielding and a French officer had been arrested, and her immediate reaction was to go to the prison where they were meant to be being kept and to see what was going on. And the prison was surrounded by a lot of civilians. There's a lot of chaos. The Americans are, say, 50 miles away, 100 miles away. The town where the prison was had been bombed by American fighters, and she and Francis used to sing Frankie and Johnny together, that song, Frankie and Johnny are lovers. So she stood outside the prison wall singing Frankie and Johnny. Quite a difficult thing, quite a brave thing to do. And she heard somebody from within the prison returning the song and realised that Francis was in there. And this is the really amazing thing. Over the next 2 days, she went into the prison, which is a Gestapo prison run by the milice. They could just have shot her on the spot. And the senior officer that she met came in dressed in all his fine SS array with a Luger pistol. And she went on and on and on at him, and she said, "I'm related to Winston Churchill. I have very powerful friends in England, and I'm related to Montgomery. If you do not release these officers, these SOE officers, you will be killed. It'll be bad for you. You will be taken out of here. I will send you to the resistance." She did this from within the prison, and this great strutting officer, by the time she'd finished with him, his hands were shaking. He'd put the gun down. He couldn't even pour out a cup of coffee, and he agreed to do what she asked. And that evening was the evening upon which Komertz and Fielding were due to be shot. They were led out to the football field. They're thinking they were going to the football field in the dark, but there was no firing squad there. They were put in a car with the strutting German officer, who now was completely cowed and wearing civilian clothes, and driven out. The car stopped, Christine got in, nobody knew what the hell was going on. The car, and they thought that everybody stayed silent because they thought, we've all been arrested, this has gone so wrong, we don't know what to do. The car went further on and stopped, and they were released, and Christine turned around and smiled at them, so she had, on her own, just using her own psychological strength, got these British officers released from a Gestapo prison. And somebody said it's the single greatest act of personal bravery in the war. And I think I really admire her for that. By the end of August, France was liberated, and the work of the SOE in France was over. Violette Szabo was transferred to Ravensbrück. Violette Szabo had been sent back in and captured because as the Americans arrived, a tank division called the Death's Head was moved from the south of France up to the north of France, and in that movement a German officer was killed by the resistance. Roadblocks went up, and by just bad luck Violette Szabo was caught. Das Reich was the name of the tank division, and Violette was caught and sent to Ravensbrück, treated as a phenomenally dangerous person, and as she was being sent to the prison, to the concentration camp in a train, she crawled down the train because there were British officers and other officers who were chained down, and she crawled down the train with the train being bombed to take water to them. So that's a level of her bravery. But she in the end was murdered, and we don't know, in the concentration camp, and we don't know whether she was shot in the head or hanged with piano wire. And they did in the end break her spirit, because she was made to operate wearing only her summer clothes in the freezing cold, doing logging. And what somebody saw and said, she was saying, "I'm so cold, I'm so cold." Noor Khan's end is equally harrowing. Noor Khan, the gentle Indian, who only wanted to write children's stories, was executed, and the man, along with 3 other prisoners, and the man tasked with executing her was told, "Give the Creole the works." And we know what he did that night when he gave her the works, because he was interrogated, and he said, "By the time I finished with her, she was a bloody mess." And I'll leave it to your imagination to work out what he did. And then he shot her in the head, and as he shot her, she said "Liberté." That was the last word that Noor Khan ever spoke. And she must have thought that her life had come to nothing, that what she said would not go beyond the walls of her cell, that sort of dark, horrible cell where she'd been tormented. But 62 years later, at SOAS, I attended the Noor Khan inaugural Liberté lecture given by an Indian civil rights lawyer, a woman called Vrinda Grover, and she specialises in women's rights. And so those words that Noor spoke have actually resonated down the years, and I think that what those women did was to set a very high moral standard for us, that when we think, "It's only little me, I can't do anything against these people, I'm too weak," you can. Everything we do does accumulate in the protection and the survival of our democracy and our freedoms. And since I wrote this book, I've learnt more about a woman called Sophie Scholl, who worked for the White Rose resistance movement in Germany. She was a 21-year-old German student, and she was guillotined for distributing anti-Nazi literature. And her last words were, she said, "It's such a fine sunny day and I must go." She said, "But what does my death matter if it encourages other people to behave well?" And that's in the middle of Germany, at the very end of her life, 21 years old. That's really it. I've just got one thing that I'd like to read to you, and then I'll take it if anybody wants to ask any questions. There's a poem that was written for Violette Szabo that she used as a code. It was a cryptographical poem, but it is also a sort of very nice poem. And it's sort of, for me, it sums up what these women were. And I'm going to read it to you now. And it's called The Life That I Have, and it goes, "The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause. For the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours." And for me that sums up those very brave women about whom I've written and who I've tried to do justice to. Thank you very much for listening. If anybody does want to ask a question, I'm very happy to try and answer it.
Whoever said that women are the weaker sex? Anybody like to ask any questions? Sorry.
Signore. Yeah.
Do we know what happened to the child of that French couple?
Yes, she's alive. She's a great spokeswoman for her mum. She's now 78. She's ran a language school. She runs the Violette Szabo Museum, and she and I did an event together at Hay-on-Wye last year. And you can see, I think you can see in her the grit that was in her mother, and she's a really nice person.
There's been some speculation over the years that in support of Operation Fortitude, that some SOE agents were fed false information and then betrayed, knowing that information would be passed over under duress and help with the deceit of Operation Fortitude. Have you come across that speculation in your travels?
I've certainly heard that speculation, and it's not. I mean, it's probably true. I mean, I don't think there's any written record that says that was done. But if you think, I mean, if you're dealing with a whole army and a huge amount of equipment and money, you lose a landing craft, you've lost 36 men. You lose an agent, you've lost one person. It's not very, in the Butcher's Bill of War, I think that would be a completely legitimate but horrible thing to have done. Just as you send people charging off into a forlorn task, sacrificing an agent like that would be a justifiable thing to do. I think. I wouldn't like to have to do it.
Did they ever have a poison put into a tooth like you?
Yeah, they were given. They didn't have poison put into a tooth. They were given these things that looked like raisins, which were cyanide pills to take. I don't think anybody ever did take them. And there was one man, an SOE agent on Crete, who was lying asleep, feeling quite hungry, felt in his pocket, and he thought, "I've got these raisins," and put them in his mouth. And at the very last minute, realised that he'd taken the cyanide pills and spat them out and was all right. In fact, I think it was Zanfilde. He was in Crete before he was sent to France.
I knew a long time ago Sir Colin Gubbins, and I'm just surprised that he didn't sack Buckmaster. Do you have any view on that?
No, I don't. I mean, I wish I knew more about, because I was writing about the sort of in the field level.
Yeah.
I tended to ignore the sort of strategic overview of Gubbins, and I don't know what. I mean, I think it's quite likely that at the time it wasn't at all clear that Buckmaster was as incompetent as he was, and that they were all learning. I mean, but Gubbins, on the other hand, did know an awful lot about how to run these organisations and had written pamphlets. But maybe his contact with Buckmaster wasn't enough, and maybe it wasn't apparent at the time. So that's as far as I can go. But I mean, to finish on Buckmaster, I know a man who worked with him after the war when Buckmaster ran he was chair of some sort of advertising commission, and they said he was so useless they had to fire him. Any other person?
Any more? Yes.
Senior.
The names that you mentioned, none of them appear to be British. Were there any British women who joined SOE?
There absolutely were. They tended to be Anglo-French. I mean, Violette Szabo was Anglo-French, and the fact is, she also her mother was French. I can't remember offhand. I mean, there was a woman called Pearl Witherington, who had lived in France all her life, although she'd been born in England and was British. And the interest of her was that she was a very sort of straightforward, slightly schoolmarmy type, and they said, well, Pearl, what you can be, I mean, you might run a safe house if you're lucky, but obviously you've no leadership potential whatsoever. This was on her report, and so she was parachuted in, and after a few months she was running an organisation with 3,000 young, stroppy, difficult to control French resistance workers, and they adored her. And so, I mean, her leadership potential was higher than almost anybody's. And the great thing about her was that she was parachuted in before she got her wings. And two things happened when she got back to England. She was recommended for the George Medal Civil Division, which she refused. She said, there is nothing civil about what I did. And the other thing was that she'd always wanted to get her wings, and so later in her life she was given the George Medal Military Division, and she said, but that wasn't nearly as good, although I liked it, but it wasn't nearly as good as the day when I got my wings. And they just gave her her wings on an honorary thing. She'd only done 4 jumps, I think you had to do 5, and she was alive and kicking until about 2 years ago.
I mean, your story has largely been a brave but sorry tale of woe.
Yes.
I mean, did SOE achieve a great deal? Is it thought that they did achieve much?
That is the $24,000 question, because, I mean, I know there's a military historian who is himself a soldier called Alan Ogden, who says that his line is that you should never send amateurs in. They should be trained, soldiers who know what they're doing, who go in just prior to whatever the major event's going to be. And the SOE was there to prepare basically for D-Day. And Max Hastings says, one of the great achievements of the SOE and the resistance were that they held up Das Reich, this armoured division, which had to get from the south of France to the north of France. It took them 9 days when it should only take 3. Well, that's utter rubbish. I mean, anybody who's tried to move an armoured division will know that it's a very, very big logistical activity. And once you get near near means within 200 miles of the front line of the beaches, you can only move at night because there are Allied aircraft all over, and the only way to stop an armoured division is with bombers or another armoured division. It's not going to be with blokes with Bren guns, but so you can't say that the SOE or even the resistance had much strategic or tactical. They didn't do that much. I mean, they did blow up communication centres. That was all very important. I think, and you could argue that could have been done by trained soldiers anyway, commandos. But why it's the $24,000 question is that the effect that it has on local morale is enormous, and it's you can't quantify it. And I mean, not just in France, but I wrote a book about the capture of a German general from outside his headquarters on Crete. Now that had zero tactical or strategic effect. It also caused massive reprisals. So you could say it was a total waste of time. But all the Cretans who know exactly what happened say the next day we all walked 2 feet taller. And this was happened before D-Day. Nobody knew that we were going to invade or that we would win. And it also must have had quite a strong psychological effect on particularly German officers in other bits of Europe. I mean, if they can hoik a German general off an island in Crete, what can they do in Paris or Berlin or Rome or wherever? So I'm completely torn as to whether the psychological morale boosting thing was worth it. I think it was, but the military effect was comparatively small. I hope that's fair to them. Signor.
Where does Odette Hallows fit into your...
She doesn't. I mean, she's quite a contentious character, and there were 39 of these SOE people, and I felt that I could only do 6 or 7 and do justice to them. And I didn't want to go down go into the black hole that is the debate about whether Odette was tortured, what happened to her, whether she was irresponsible, whether Churchill, the agent called Churchill, whether they behaved irresponsibly. So I don't really have a view about her. So I'm sorry to say, but I mean I should have, I suppose.
Any more?
Did you see the BBC programme on Monday?
No, I didn't.
Special Agent Selection, World War II, which is the SOE.
No,
progress.
I was on my way back from Egypt on Monday, but
I can recommend it. They did mention quite a few of the ladies.
Did they?
About.
They've sort of put.
They've taken a selection of civilians and they're putting them through
SOE training
and training in a Scottish manor house.
I mean,
all wearing period costumes, using the training manuals that have been declassified since.
I mean, just we're coming to the end now, but one of the interesting things about this is whether how effective that training was. I mean, there should have been many more radio operators trained and many more radios wanged into France and much more done on the technology of the radio, making these radios as small as you could possibly make them. There's also the fact one agent in the field. Stop! Shut up. Said it's all very well. He said they come here. They've been trained in unarmed combat. They can use these little daggers and all that. He said, but they haven't been trained to ride bicycles, and that's what we really want, is that they can ride bicycles so they can move around.
Interestingly, in that programme, which has just been mentioned, one of the people who did best was a 5-foot-tall woman scientist.
There you go. I mean, that's
absolutely tiny she was, and she was brilliant.
I mean, the last person I'll mention is a tiny Australian called Nancy Wake, who was she was a real good time girl, but as brave as anything. And when she wasn't fighting the Germans, she was drinking the contents of the villa's cellars that she found herself in. She killed people with her bare hands. She condemned a spy to be shot. The brave resistance workers with her wouldn't do it. So she said, if you won't do it, I'll do it. And she's like the little tiny person. An American agent said she led us like a man, Nancy Wake. I mean, I could go. There's such a lot to tell you about these women, and not enough time. But if you buy the book, of course, when it comes,
and it is coming out in paperback in July, we're told. So keep an eye out for it. Greg, thank you very much indeed. We'll draw it to a close there because we're all waiting for a drink and a nibble.
Thank you very much indeed. That's great.
Right.